By way of introduction, we are doing Revelation, believe it or not. And the idea behind this is, as I was preparing the Revelation sermons from earlier this summer, they're just, when you're writing a sermon, the hard part, Leon knows this, the hard part is what not to say. It's cutting stuff out, right? It's having too many ideas from a lifetime of experience. And so I thought, man, it would be really helpful if there was a way that I could take all the extra stuff and figure out an outlet for it. So I'm going to try to do the best job I can do of not making this feel like you had to be sitting through the sermon series. We're going to talk about reading Revelation, and I think I was trying to think of a good subtitle, and this is what I came up with: Cautiously Curious About the Last Book of the Bible. And the reason I use that is because I think that there are some people who are just really intense about Revelation, and it can be a little off-putting because that's all they think about, that's all they talk about, that's all they focus on. And then there's people who maybe distance themselves from the book of Revelation because of those types. But then I feel like I occupy a category, and I know a lot of us do, where we're interested in it. We want to know more about it, but we're a little tentative because we don't want to get down a path where we're like, oh, great, now I'm in some sort of wild religious conspiracy theory twilight zone. So my early experience with the book of Revelation, really, like a lot of people growing up in church, was I would open up that book and read it during a sermon that I thought was a little boring. So I would just kind of cruise through there, and you got the dragons and the beasts and the seals and there's blood and plagues and all kinds of things. And so it was interesting, but I really didn't have any idea what was going on. And so it was pretty strange. It was pretty inaccessible. These are some terms that are commonly used in the discussion of the book of Revelation. None of these terms appear in the book of Revelation. They're vocabulary created to talk about Revelation. And most of those terms have little prefixes that you can add onto them to describe a whole different way of thinking about the book. And a lot of this stuff is just, it gets really wild, really out there, but you almost have to learn a whole new vernacular to even begin to talk about it. I've had people come up to me and say, not come up to me, but in conversation say, well, what's your position on the millennium, post-millennium, pre-millennium, millennium? What, are you a preterist? What do you believe about, I had someone say, what's your eschatology? And it caught me so off guard that I was like, I don't even remember what the word is. And then, oh yeah, it all kind of came back to me. But there's this whole vocabulary around the book of Revelation that really makes it inaccessible. And I think that's a tragedy, because the book of Revelation is incredible. And I think it is life-changing. And going through it in a sermon series over this summer was, I felt like for me, a little personal revival. Every time I'm studying it, I'm sitting there kind of overwhelmed by the depth of the questions it's asking of me. Particularly questions like, what would you do if your faith were challenged in this way? How would you handle that? And then realizing that my faith is often challenged that way in ways that I'm not aware of, which the book of Revelation is all about revealing. So if there is a basic premise to Revelation, it can be summed up in something that sounds like this. There are forces that seem incredibly powerful that are conspiring to undermine your confidence in God. Be strong, stand firm, even to the point of death, and you will be rewarded. For example, if you can look these up, welcome to. I'll try to have most scriptures that I'm referencing on the screen at any given time. But for example, if you look at each individual section where John, or where Jesus dictates a letter to the 7 churches to whom this is written, you'll notice that they all end with the same rhythm, the same cadence. So for example, Revelation 2:7 says this: he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes. And this is the old NIV. The new NIV actually uses to him who is victorious, which I think I like a little better. I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, of course a Genesis reference, which is in the paradise of God. And then on the bottom I put the other references from the other letters. Each letter has that challenge. Be victorious. Overcome. And little fun side note, you know the Greek word for victory or victorious. Does anybody want to take a stab at what it is? Anybody have any guesses in the recesses of their mind, their memory? Close. We use it as a brand name for a shoe. Yes, Nike is victory, and this is the verb form for be victorious. So it's the same word we get the word Nike from, which is also the goddess of victory.
But it's pronounced Nikao.
Correct, yes. We're fudging a little bit because we're non-Greek speakers, but yes, you're right. So it's a challenge, but it's also a promise of a reward, and I think that that's pretty crucial. Like that's something, we're neglecting something here and now. We're abdicating something that we could have here and now for the promise of something better. Now, it's not just the letters that talk about this. So next slide, if you would. Revelation 12:11. This is just a reference talking about these martyrs. The book uses the word martyrs. These martyrs, they triumphed over him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. In other words, you're seeing this portrait of people who had given their lives to Christ, and you're kind of called to ask yourself the same kind of question. Would I do that? Would I be one of these people wearing a white robe? Or Revelation 21:7, those who are victorious, again, Nike, will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. And so you can see that theme woven throughout the book, this idea of, hey, things look grim and bleak, but I promise you, God is on top of it, and if you stand firm, you will receive a reward. That's essentially, I mean, John, it would have been boring had he just written that, but that's essentially what you get if you distill the basics of the book of Revelation down to its essence. So it asks this really pointed question of us, the reader, in a world of intense pressure to compromise, what do we do? And compromise has to, that's a ton of different areas. That's a ton of different things. In a world where we want to have financial security or we want to have job stability, but sometimes those things come at the cost of putting our families first or maybe putting our church community first. What choices do we make? And it's amazing to me as Christians that sometimes we don't even blink. We just immediately, financial security. I got to have a job. I got to pay the bills. I got to pay the mortgage. I got to take care of my family. But what's the cost? And I think Revelation really challenges us to kind of see clearly what's really happening in these daily choices. So that's what Revelation is about. And of course, you know that there's a lot of controversies around Revelation. I guess what I'm hoping to get at is I want to be as kind as possible because these controversies, they even if they can be harmful, they still are secondary. And I think that we can find some common ground and maybe move ahead. So that's, I would imagine there probably have been church splits over premillennialism, postmillennialism. I don't know of it. Yeah, undoubtedly. If there's church splits over like carpet color, I'm sure there's been church splits over those things as well. But I do think that this is important. These are secondary. These are maybe misunderstandings and confusion or maybe indoctrination. This is the only thing somebody has heard their entire life. And so I don't want to be unkind because they have this different perspective. But it does, people's temperatures get pretty high around some of these conversations because it's so important. In fact, and we'll get into this later on, there are some ways that it really affects their understanding of current politics and how they vote and what they want to see geopolitically. And we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because we're still in the introduction here. So when I went through the sermon series and in this class, my goal as much as possible is to avoid these terms. Not because they're bad, they have a purpose, they have a reason. Theologians use them. All the commentaries that I've used to study, they all use them. But to me, they tend to make Revelation inaccessible to most people, including myself. And I think that they so predefine a perspective that they don't allow for maybe some variance and some nuance and some different ideas. And I don't like how they lock a person into a way of thinking. Because when you have conversations with people who use these terms, they'll say, are you pre, post, or millennial? And you're like, what? Is this multiple choice? Are those the only... Now, I understand what they're getting at, and I understand the value of that in a lot of situations, but I try to avoid those as much as possible. In fact, these terms were created because of controversies. They were created because of arguments about different perspectives on the book of Revelation. Let me show you one real quick. I have a YouTube comment from our YouTube page here at Woodbury on this sermon. It may be hard to read because it's small print, but this was where we talked about the mark of the beast. And so we were talking about Revelation 13, the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth. Essentially, we were talking about the bad guys. And this one gentleman, I don't know who they are, commented the mark of the beast, where they abbreviated it. And I thought, well, that's very clever. TMOTB, the mark of the beast, is mentioned in Revelation 13, but Revelation 13 was totally fulfilled in the first century. Therefore, there is nothing in this chapter that has any direct relevance to the 21st century or beyond. And I thought, he could be right, but man, what a narrow way of thinking about it, where you're like, there is nothing about this that can have any application to me. And that may not be what he's getting at specifically, but that's how that reads. As a Christian, I just don't even need to read Revelation chapter 13 because there's no relevance beyond the first century. It's only an amusing understanding of things that might have happened in first century. It's a way to pass the time, but nothing that can really affect me. But I think that eliminates things that really can affect us, that are important for us. And I responded to him, just said, oh, well, appreciate your comment. If you watch the sermon, I don't think this guy watched the sermon. I think several of the comments we received, people have not watched the actual sermon. I think they've got their idea and they just want to comment about it. But that's a very specific point of view, and it makes Revelation pretty unhelpful for us in 2022. And I think Revelation's helpful. So what I want to do is talk about, I'm trying to set up a little bit about what Revelation's about, kind of the way we want to approach this. But when we did the sermon series, we talked about 6 rules. We talked about 7, but I've made them 6 since then. Perspectives that I think are important to have as you read the entire letter. So you may remember I talked about the anamorphic art, which was the art that can only be seen from one perspective. From any other perspective, it just looks like a mess, but when you stand from the right spot, it kind of all comes together and you can see all the pieces fit. I think this is part of like getting to that spot so you can see the art the way the artist intended it. So I think John is composing a beautiful piece of literature. I think he's been thoughtful. I don't think he's spitballing. I don't think he's just throwing stuff out here. I think he's intricately composing something that's good for us and helpful for us. And if we understand the tools he was using and what he was trying to get at, we're going to have a better time understanding what Revelation is all about. And so
Absolutely, because that's by design.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Not just the book of John or the other gospel. This one also is by design.
Yes.
So absolutely was created.
Yeah.
The way you just described it.
And maybe even more intentional, thoughtful design than average. So what Leon is saying, if you can't hear him, that the Gospels have design. Ephesians has design. 1 John, 2 John. So does Revelation. It has a thoughtful approach that he had in mind as he was writing. So what we're going to do tonight in the time that we have is we're going to go over those 6 rules, and I actually think that there are a couple areas that maybe you've had questions or wondered or some things that will help unlock a little bit of understanding. So first rule, Revelation rule for reading Revelation, number 1, is that this book is a letter. This book is a letter. There should be a slide that corresponds to that if you can find it, but no big deal if you can't. This book is a letter. There we go. Revelation is a letter. Now this is important because you know that 1 Corinthians is a letter because it says, hey, everybody in Corinth, this is Paul. I'm writing you and I want to tell you some stuff. And so when you read elements in 1 Corinthians where you're like, whoa, what was happening there? People were getting drunk during communion. Some people were eating all the food and other people weren't. There was some guy sleeping with his father's wife. Whoa, what was happening. But you understand that there's a context for that particular congregation. And Paul is taking eternal truths and he's applying them in this specific context. And as a good reader of the Bible, we want to understand that context and then work our way back to those eternal truths so we can understand what is the full eternal reality that Paul is using to come to some of these conclusions. But I don't know that we think of Revelation as a letter. In fact, most of the New Testament is a letter. Arguably, even Luke is potentially a letter to Theophilus. But those would be the only exceptions, is that potentially Matthew, Mark, and John are not letters, and then the rest of it is. But Revelation is as well. Because Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. So of these 7 churches, Ephesus being one of them, we have this reference to maybe John actually worked there, knew the people. And so when John's writing a letter to the church in Ephesus, he's maybe thinking, I know Joe, and I know Mary, and I know their kids, and I know where they work. He's thinking about real people. And when those people get their letter, which the whole process of sending and receiving mail in the first century is actually fascinating. I wish we could get into it. But anyway, when they receive their letter and they're opening it up, they're like, oh yeah, John, he knows us. He's writing us something that matters. Now, this seems like a silly thing. What does it matter that the book of Revelation is a letter? If it's a letter to people in the first century, then it had to mean something to the people to whom it was written. And that may even seem like, well, yeah, that's what a letter is. The reason that's important is that John isn't saying, I'm going to write some stuff down, I'm going to send it to these people, and nobody's going to have any clue what's happening for about 2,000 years when someone establishes the UN, and that's going to be when everything starts to happen. Or when Saddam Hussein gets overthrown in Iraq. That's when everything kicks off. So the point being that it would be a strange thing for John to sit down and compose a letter to real people that have no relevance to them for 2,000 years. It's kind of the opposite problem of that guy who wrote the YouTube comment. Like, that only mattered to them and doesn't matter to us. As if John was saying, I'm only writing to people thousands of years later who live on the other side of the world. I listened to a bunch of sermons in preparation too, and one of them was by Rick Ashley in the Hills from 2015. And he the way he phrased it I thought was helpful. Is like, it can never mean what it never meant. And I thought that was pretty helpful. That was a good way to say that. It can never mean what it never meant. Because it would just be such a weird, bizarre act. Like, here's a letter. It's full of symbols you're not going to understand, but Hal Lindsey will come along and he'll explain it for you in 2,000 years from now. And some of you are like, how many of you have any clue who Hal Lindsey is? How many of you have met Hal Lindsey personally? Yeah, my mom has a story about him she'll have to tell sometime. How many of you have no idea? Late Great Planet Earth, no idea. So it's a book from the late 70s, is that right? Yeah, before my time, I don't know. Late 70s, early 80s. And it really, on a popular level, and it was a huge selling book, turned into like a film, even though it was a nonfiction book, popularized the idea that the rapture, that Jesus was going to come back and take all the faithful Christians, and then there was going to be this period of really hard tribulation, and it really popularized these ideas. I don't think it was Hal Lindsey. Somebody would have to Google this, but it was someone else who wrote 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. And then the sequel to 88 Reasons That the Rapture Will Happen in 1988 was, I can't remember what it was, but it was something like 89 Reasons the Rapture Will Happen in 1989. And, those books, unfortunately, some of them, and the Late Great Planet Earth still sells. A lot of them, are in clearance bins. I've bought a couple from thrift stores that it's just interesting to read. What was the big popular cultural thing that they were trying to see in the book of Revelation? But it just seems like it can't mean what it never meant. It's a letter to real people. John was trying to encourage a real outcome for these people. And we talked about this in the sermon, and I won't get into it in detail, but just imagine that your daily life was completely intertwined with local temple worship. Like, in order to do what you do, in order to work at the office you work at, or to be an electrician or a plumber, or to get your retirement benefits, you had to go down to the local temple and offer a little sacrifice, and you had to be part of the little guild or whatever it was. Imagine that your livelihood and your family's livelihood and your social status was all tied up in that. And you can imagine a Christian really having a wrestling match with that. How do we live in this world but not give in to that compromise? And you can see why John writes things like, to him who overcomes, you will receive. You can see what he's trying to encourage. And we don't have the same problem. In their day and age, it was like the opposite of separation of church and state. It was like a forced union between temple and state. We don't have that same problem, but our pressures are different. And so I think we can take the lessons that John is trying to encourage in these people and work them out in our own lives. So the book is a letter. Revelation rule number 2, the letter is an apocalypse. Apocalypse. You guys know what the word apocalypse means, right? Yeah, well, yes. Dad, you got it right. Wow, very good. But we think of it, in English, we think of it as a disaster, a cataclysmic disaster, a tsunami, an earthquake, something that's tornado, and it's just left, terrible awfulness in its wake. Like a weatherman standing outside in a hurricane. I've never seen anything like it. This is wind of apocalyptic proportions, right? But the word literally means revealing. So for example, if I were to have a little, statue here on stage, and it were to be covered over with a little cloth, and I'm going to reveal the statue, and I pulled that off, that I have apocalypsed the statue. That's all that word means. And it's literally the first word in the book of Revelation. It's what the book starts with, the word revealing. So we have to use the definite article, the revealing, but it's revealing of Jesus Christ. That's how the book starts. And it references a genre of literature that they were familiar with. So it was apocalyptic literature. You see elements of apocalyptic literature in the book of Daniel. We're going to talk about that in a second. You see it in parts of the book of Isaiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, where things get wild and crazy in the Bible, and there's these big, crazy symbols. That's an indication you might be reading apocalyptic literature. There's other non-biblical apocalyptic literature too. So if you want to read, 4th Ezra, 1st Enoch, the Syllabine Oracles, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, never read any of those books. But my commentaries that I like said these are all also apocalyptic literature, and I trust them. So, closest equivalent, if you were thinking of a genre of literature that fit that idea of apocalypse, meaning that it's something using untrue things to describe reality, can you think of a genre of literature that we might even have today that uses things that aren't real to describe things that are real? Allegory, for sure. Can you even think of a book or two that you might have read when you were in middle school or high school that were like that? I talked about one of them in my sermon, so at least you remember one. Oh, Chronicles of Narnia, yeah, that would fit. It's a fantasy novel, but C.S. Lewis was trying to describe something real. I hadn't even considered that. That's a good example. Parables, yeah. You guys are real biblical here. I was thinking of... I was thinking of Animal Farm. That's what I was thinking of. Remember at the end of Animal Farm, the pigs... Nobody remembers that? They're trying to, organize this government, and the pigs are like, all animals are equal, and they get everybody on their side, and then by the end of the book, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, and George Orwell is trying, poke at human governments and the ways that these socialist governments have said, oh, no, we're all equal, and then all of a sudden there's some people who are all... Anyway, it's satire or allegory. We have that today. Nobody is reading George Orwell thinking, this guy believes that pigs can talk. Nobody's assuming that. They assume that he's trying to communicate something real. Same with apocalyptic literature. We're going to read stuff about dragons and beasts and a woman giving birth and all plagues and angels dumping out bowls. And John's not trying to say this stuff is happening, but he's trying to say these images capture a reality that is big and hard to describe. So it's a genre of literature. It's dramatic. It's over the top. Gulliver's Travels, that's another one. Jonathan Swift. I've never. Yeah, a lot of it's very, very political satire. So this letter is an apocalypse. Revelation is an apocalypse. Number 3, Revelation is Hebrew Bible. And I like to use the phrase Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament, because I think when we use the phrase Old Testament, it sounds dismissive. People are like, I don't care about the Old Testament. But I think we use the phrase Hebrew Bible. It's like, oh, these are what Hebrew people, even to this day, still used as their guide to life and their way of understanding. I like that better than Old Testament. But John, when he writes, is taking elements from Hebrew scriptures and he's remixing them and giving them new life and sometimes new shades of meaning. But it's figures that people were familiar with. So, for example, let me give you one. Revelation 13, verse 1. This is one you may be familiar with. Revelation 13, 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. Now, you're reading that, I'm reading that as a 11-year-old kid who's bored out of his mind listening to a sermon, and I'm like, what is this? This is nuts. It sounds like a Godzilla movie. Like, what in the world is this? But someone who was steeped in the Hebrew Bible would read that, and a light would go off, and they would be like, oh, that's Daniel. That's Daniel chapter 7. In fact, if you go to the next one, Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came out of the sea. And by the way, the 4 great beasts are the same in the same order that Revelation 13 talks about this beast being an amalgamation of these different beasts. And then if you jump down to verse 17 or 16, the end of 16, verse 17, so he told me and gave me, this is an angel, gave me an interpretation of these things. So Daniel is like, what is happening? And an angel says, well, let me help you understand what's happening. And in Daniel chapter 16 and verse 17, the 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise up from the earth. So a person who understood Hebrew Bible would read Revelation and think, oh yeah, that sounds a lot like Daniel. In fact, it sounds like John is creating a mega beast from different elements of what Daniel talked about. And if Daniel's beasts were kings or kingdoms, then what is it likely that John's beast is? A mighty, ferocious, wild, crazy, terrifying beast. A kingdom that seems so invincible and so dominant that nobody could possibly stop it. Well, what kingdom might have existed during the time of John that seemed like this giant, terrifying mega beast? Right? We all know. We don't have to read that, and I want to be careful about not being dismissive. We don't need to read that and think, oh, that's talking about the European common market, and that's talking about the UN, or that's talking about any other wild, crazy ideas, because the Bible interprets itself for us so often. It's really helpful to know that when we're reading something that we're like, where is this going? There's often Hebrew Bible context for it. Not always, but often. And it's really valuable. And there's just an endless amount of scholarly resources that will say, yeah, here's what that symbol comes from. There's what crowns mean. That's what That's what beasts. That's what whatever else. All right. Revelation rule number 4. Revelation is instant replay or recapitulation. You remember this from the sermon series? Recapitulation. I think I may be misrepresenting my mother here, but I think I'm right. So I'm going to tell you a story, and if I'm wrong, she won't remember if I'm wrong. We were watching, I think it was a football game, and someone had made a great catch, and people in the room were reacting to the game. And of course, because football is about 11 minutes of action and 2 hours and 49 minutes of replay and commercials, there was immediately a replay after that. And my mom said, oh, he just did it again. And of course, we all thought that was funny because she was watching the replay and it wasn't true. It was what you could call a recapitulation of what just happened. And if you watch a football game, you're going to see a recapitulation of the same action 4, 5, 6 times, all from various angles. This is a pretty common illustration for the idea of recapitulation. I read it in several books and it totally makes sense to me. But recapitulation is retelling the same basic events from a slightly different angle, or maybe a largely different angle. And it's not a strange thing. Even in the Bible, it's not a strange thing. Can you think of any stories in Scripture that are retold several times in a row from slightly different angles? Yeah, the Gospels. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the story of Christ from slightly different angles, sometimes with slightly different details, which is always interesting to dig through. You may not know or care about, but I like Christopher Nolan movies. He's made some movies like Inception and Dunkirk and Tenet, and all his movies have to do with time and how time plays out and seeing things from various angles. And I think that's a pretty good way of understanding what might be happening with recapitulation. So recapitulation, the way that I see it work in the book of Revelation, for example, Revelation 21:4 says this: He will wipe every tear from their eyes. That's where we get the hymn, no tears in heaven. Wonderful. Can't wait. There's going to be no reason for sorrow in heaven. It's going to be awesome. But then Revelation 7:17, several chapters earlier, for the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Well, he sounds like he's talking about the same thing separated by quite a few chapters. So a lot of scholars throughout history have said, well, maybe he's describing human history, and then he starts over and describes human history from another angle, and then he starts over and describes human history from another angle. Let me give you another example of how this might work. In Revelation 8:5, this is the section of Revelation that talks about the seals and the trumpets and the bowls. If you've ever read that section, that's the hard one. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, and it's all these disasters. At the end of each one of those sections, it has the same basic imagery talking about the end of what he's describing. And he talks about thunder, rumblings, lightning, and an earthquake. 11:19, lightning, rumblings, thunder, and an earthquake. Revelation 16:18, lightning, rumblings, thunder, and a severe earthquake. Almost as if he's signaling we're at the end here of the story again. We're at the end of what we're describing. And it does seem, and scholars differ a little bit on how often he does it. There's a great book by William Hendrickson called More Than Conquerors, and he thinks he repeats the whole of human history 7 times throughout the entirety of the book of Revelation. And it's a really cool way of thinking. It doesn't quite make sense to me. I think he does it several times. But I think as we read the book of Revelation, what we're not seeing is an unfolding chronological sequence of events. We're seeing, hey, here's what human history looks like from above, and here's what human history looks like from below, and here's what human history looks like from the good guy's point of view, and here's what human history looks like from the bad guy's point of view. And as you read Revelation with that perspective, it really makes a lot more sense than trying to jumble all these things into one kind of sequential thing. Revelation is recapitulation or instant replay. I should pause and make sure. That's a lot. That's a kind of a big claim, and there's a lot of academic literature on it, but that doesn't mean you should just accept that. That's a big claim, but happy to talk about that more. Any questions about that? Does that explain in a way that at least makes sense, even if you don't agree with it, which you don't have to? All right. And by the way, if you have any other questions about anything else, please feel free to stop me. All right, Revelation rule number 5 is Revelation is not just about the future. And I put just kind of in parentheses there because Revelation is about the future. There's no doubt it's about the future. It describes the new heaven and the new earth and the eternal reward. But it's not just about the future. This has been my presumption. Maybe you felt like this too. Most of the time, when at least I heard or thought of Revelation, I heard of it from the point of view that someone was saying, pretty much it just describes what happens in our future. right? From Patrick, born in 1977, from my point of view, from my future, or maybe just a few years before me. That's always how I've kind of assumed that Revelation worked. And that's how I feel like a lot of popular level understanding of Revelation works. It's talking about our future. Does that seem fair to claim that a lot of people view it that way? So if you could, what it might be is if you could decipher the code just right, you could unlock what's coming next. And a lot of the popular level writing about Revelation have a tagline that says what the Bible says about what's coming next. And again, Revelation is about the future, but it's kind of like a Batman movie or a Superman movie. Nobody in the theater is confused about whether Lex Luthor or Superman is going to win. Everybody knows Superman's going to win. It's a foregone conclusion to the story that Superman's going to win. So you're not predicting as much as you're saying, yes, that's how the story is going to unfold. Apocalyptic literature, who was going to win? The good guys or the bad guys? The good guys are going to win. And there are some elements that seem pretty incredible in terms of how it describes what happens and the 10 horns and the crowns and all that. But it's not just about the future, and that's important for us to understand. I felt like, and I've even done this at times in my life, where I felt like something I was seeing in the news was so historic that it had to be in the book of Revelation. You've ever felt like that? You're like, this has to be. This is such a big deal. It's got to be. And there's been times where I've opened up my Bible and I thought, well, this has got to be in the book of Revelation. When I was 23 years old, I think, if I'm doing my math right, in 2001, and planes hit the Twin Towers, I was like, this has got to be. I mean, how could this not be in the book of Revelation? And I heard people at the time say, yeah, the two towers were the two witnesses in Revelation 30. It gets a little wild. But that's the way of discovering what's happening in the future, is you take an event and you say, well, this must be what this is here. And then you try to unwind Revelation going forward and going backward based on that historic event. The interesting thing is in the book More Than Conquerors by William Hendrickson, and it's so weird that he uses a quote from Romans about a book about Revelation. But anyway, he says the same thing, but in his example, he's like, yeah, a lot of people thought the Great War was going to be in the book of Revelation. And I don't think that's true. And because it was written, his book was written in 30 something, before there was a Second World War. I guess it'd be 1920s. Which is kind of interesting, because at every generation there's been something that people have thought, this is it. This is the apocalypse. This is Armageddon. This has to be it. Whether it's World War I or World War II or the Gulf War or Vietnam or the tsunami in 2004 or, I don't know, Bay of Pigs invasion or COVID. How about that? I feel like I've seen a lot of articles that said, is COVID in the book of Revelation? But Revelation 1:19, this is an important verse. Write, therefore, what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. It's not just talking about our future. He may be talking about the future, but it's not our future. And then Revelation rule number 6. Revelation rule number 6. And this is my estimation, as of right now, in my understanding of Scripture, of the book of Revelation. This is the last one, but maybe I'll add more later as I go. Who knows? But Revelation is a revelation. Yeah, I know, clever, right? Yeah. So, my mom says, yeah, that's great. So literally, this is the first word of the book, like I was telling you earlier. But I think it's valuable that we understand that Revelation was not written to obscure. He's not trying to say, I don't want you to understand what's going on. It's written to reveal. Remember that, apocalypse. He's writing to show us what's true. And the hard part is that what we are seeing with our eyes feels very real. And Rome looks like it's going to dominate. And Rome looks like it's going to be here forever. And Rome looks like it's going to crush everybody in its path. And John says, let me pull back the curtain, because I want you to really see what's going on. The rule of Rome is not inevitable. It is not eternal. There will be a day, and this is true, there will be a day when there is a cross hanging at the entrance to the Colosseum, where at one time Christians were killed for their faith. But trying to get people to understand that truth when things look the way they do, because I think people feel like that now sometimes. Wow, the world looks grim. America's in a tailspin. It's a disaster. Things are just getting worse and worse. Come, Lord Jesus, it's awful. And I think John would say, no. The only certainty is the doom of the enemy. But the church will advance. The church will grow. The gates of Hades will not prevail against what I'm building. But it doesn't always look that way. And it's so valuable for us as Christians to remember that what we perceive with our eyes is not necessarily the way it is. What we assume, or the way things seem, are not really the way things are. What seems strong might be weak. What seems on the verge of extinction might actually be on the verge of growth and thriving. What seems grim may be hopeful. Defeat actually maybe victory. Can you imagine the people surrounding Jesus at the cross? There, this is it for this guy's movement. Little did they know that they were inaugurating this just global transformation. They had no idea, because the way things looked were not the way things were. So the beast in Revelation 13, he might look big and unstoppable, but the author, John, only gives a few lines to the beast. He gives a lot more lines to these songs of how the beast has been destroyed and the dragon has been cast down. So what may seem true now may not be true, because Revelation is a revealing. So, with those rules, and I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure if you read other authors, they're going to find even more wiser ways to view Revelation. But these are the ones that I think really helped me as I read Revelation to remember, to keep in mind, to help me kind of unwind and discern what I'm reading, what I'm seeing through. It's like the old Sherlock Holmes quote, how do you figure out what's actually happening? And he says, well, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever is left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And I think that there's an element of that. Once you've walked away thinking, okay, Revelation had to mean something to the people to whom it was written. It was a genre of literature that employed the same kind of rules of genre throughout history. It's Hebrew Bible. A lot of what we understand comes from Hebrew Scripture. It's a recapitulation of the same story. It's not just about our future, but maybe about the future. And it reveals things that are, but maybe don't seem the way they are. I think when we read it, it's going to be a lot clearer. So what we're going to do in this class, we just have a couple minutes left. First of all, let me ask if there are any questions. Covered a lot of ground. Any questions? We covered a lot of ground without actually getting very far into the book of Revelation. So what we're going to try to do in this class is we're going to try to break the book of Revelation down into bigger chunks. And I'm going to try to draw your attention back to some of the things we covered in the sermons, but not dwell on those, and try to get more into the things that we couldn't cover or the questions that maybe you had about particular areas. All right. I'm not going to tell you that you're going to understand it completely and thoroughly, but I think we will have at least a greater appreciation. And I hope, most of all, you will feel like I did working through this book. You will feel fortified in making choices that are faithful, even in the face of personal temptation or exterior or external pressure to give up on God and to be faithless and to cling to other things. That's what it's about. And so if the book of Revelation is only academic, then we've missed the point. It's got to be practical, because that's the way John intended it. Any questions? All right, what a compliant audience. You guys are great.